Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Holy Trinity Aylesbury. Welcome to our next meeting for Why I Believe. I hope you had a great Christmas. It's great to see you again. I hope you're ready for 8 days of exploring why we believe the Christian faith is true, because tonight we have Dr. Max Baker-Hytch from Oxford University, who's a lecturer in philosophy. And next Wednesday, we have our next meeting. So we've got back-to-back weeks. That's just how it's broken, because these guys have been busy speaking in schools during the day. And next week, we have amazing Dr. Elaine Storkey coming to share with us why she believes the truth of the gospel and the truth of Christianity. Now, all of you here this evening, you may or may not believe that, but that's kind of why we're here, to explore that. To ask questions, and your questions are welcome, your questions are encouraged, and they make up a lot of the evening. So let's make the absolute most of having Justin Brierley and Max here this evening. Now, just a couple of quick notices for you. If you don't know the dates or you want to see the program of what's going on, do pick up one of these on the way out. On the way out also will be flyers for Elaine Storkey's visit next week. I just want to always encourage you guys to take 2 or 3. One for yourself, so you remember that it's happening, but then one for a friend who may or may not have a Christian faith, and maybe one for a co-worker or a family member or something like that. What we want to do in these evenings is put Christianity back on the table of discussion. We think these things should be talked about and explored, and we've got a host of people coming through the year from all kinds of different disciplines, the arts, the sciences, the humanities. But these are all people who've thought clearly about their faith and believe. And we want to explore that with them and hear from them. So Elaine Storkey is coming next week. Then we have Joe Boot coming in March the 27th. So that will be our Easter special. Just if I could have the next slide, please. I want to say a special thank you to the people who've made this possible. That is the Christian Evidence Society, who've helped fund this program. We hope to run this program next year as well, from September onwards. Do encourage people to come along if you find these valuable. Also, the Montgomery Trust have also made possible for our speakers to speak in schools during the day. Don't let that hold you back from asking your hardest questions, even though they've already been speaking for a few hours today. Next slide, please. Just to make you aware that John Lennox is coming on May the 1st, even though the main flyer that's gone out says April 24th. That's going to be a really, really special day. Do make sure you don't miss that. John is a very special man, and he's done a lot, he's said a lot, he's seen a lot, he's got a lot to share, and that's going to be a really fantastic evening. So don't miss it, but make sure you remember that it's May the 1st. Next slide, please. Do check out the Why I Believe website for the latest on what is going on, for bios on all the speakers. You know, we'd love you to share that with your friends and family and co-workers. Let them have a good look at who's coming throughout the year to make sure that you see all the guests as they come. Also, the Aylesbury Vale YFC YouTube page, we put the talks up there so you can hear Justin's talk, and the evenings we've had with Dennis Alexander and Sir Colin Humphries are up on there as well. Later on, we will put up the slide which has the QR code. And if you scan that code with your phone, it will take you to the Slido page where you can put in your questions, which will be fed straight to Max and Justin at the front. You can also vote for the questions that you most want answered, so you can just give a thumbs up. If someone's typed in a question, you're like, oh, I really want that question to get asked. You know, give it a thumbs up and it will move to the top of the list. Just to say a little bit about myself and what we do here. My name is Sam McKee. I wear a number of different hats. I'm a molecular biologist. I'm a doctoral researcher in philosophy of science. I'm a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, but I'm also the director at Aylesbury Vale Youth of Christ here. If you want to support our work to make sure these kinds of things happen more often, please do so. We always appreciate it. We want to run events like this all year round to encourage people to have meaningful conversations about Christianity. Christianity and belief in God has kind of been taken off the table of conversation in this country at the moment, and we want to put it back on the table and show there's good reasons to think about, but also, question and probe and explore, have conviction about what you believe. There is a bookshop at the back as you came in. A lot of books have been written by the speakers and the people who are coming to these evenings. Also, Justin, in a moment, is going to tell you about his fantastic work on the surprising rebirth of belief in God. But Justin has some of his books here afterwards, which you can purchase from him. And I'm sure if you ask him nicely, he'll be happy to sign them as well. Max has a book coming out next month, but it's not ready to be here this evening. But as I'm sure I'll tell you more about it. But it might possibly make your brain melt because it's a proper academic piece of philosophy. But some people like that, so there you go. Also, if you need a bit of discipline and rhythm in your life, it's still January, so it's still the beginning of the year. Andy, the vicar here, has written a really great book about, it's called For the Journey, but it's about discipline and rhythm in your life. If you find yourself having got to a place where maybe life is a bit disorientated or you feel a bit disorientated and you want to build in some proper rhythms of discipline and habit, you can get this book at the back there. Just pop some money in or see him about it. He's not here tonight, but you can see him about it next week and pay him then. But that's a fantastic thing to invest in yourself as well at the start of 2024. Right, without any further ado, please can we give a warm welcome to Justin Brierley and Dr. Max Baker-Hytch.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Max, and just a reminder to be thinking of those questions that may occur to you during the course of our conversation. We'll begin, first of all, with about 40 minutes of conversation, or half an hour, 40 minutes, but we'll make sure to leave a good sort of 20 minutes to half an hour of questions from you. So I believe they will be showing that Slido QR code that you can then send your question in, and I'll make sure to be watching out for those as well. Max, Sam kindly said that my book will be available. I'm very happy to give a copy. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is a book and a podcast documentary series. So if you're a podcast listener, you might want to look that up as well, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's really a book about why new atheism grew old and why secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. And that's something we might touch on with Max, because Max has certainly had plenty of interactions with a number of the new atheist figures over the years. But can I ask you to give another warm round of applause for Max? Thank you. Max Baker-Hytch, thank you for joining us this evening. I should say Dr. Max Baker-Hytch. Not that you're going to perform surgery on anyone, but it's more of an academic PhD. It sounds really highfalutin, to be honest. You're an Oxford philosophy lecturer. What does an average day look like for an Oxford University philosophy lecturer?
Well, it starts off probably much like the day of anyone with young children, which is sort of trying to corral them out of bed and get them to school on time. But
so far, our days are very similar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Once I sort of get going properly, I suppose, my job really divides into three types of role that I play. So one is teaching in the form of lectures, tutorials, seminars. The other is research, so working on academic articles and books. And we'll probably, I imagine, talk a bit more about some of the topics I work on. And the other is sort of just looking out for the pastoral well-being of students, all of the sort of admin that goes around making the other stuff run, and a whole gamut of meetings, that sort of thing.
So Oxford University itself obviously is composed of lots of individual colleges. And can you tell us which college you're based at?
Yeah. So the analogy I often use, this works well with Americans, is that the way to think about the structure of Oxford University is that you've got the university, which is like the federal government.
Okay.
And so everyone is part of Oxford University in the way that everyone, whichever state they live in, has an American passport issued by the American government. But then everyone is in a college, which is a bit like the state, the state of Texas, let's say, which does have some of its own distinctive features. So I'm in the philosophy faculty in terms of the university, the federal government. I'm in Wycliffe Hall as my college, and Wycliffe Hall is one of, I think now, 4 or 5 so-called permanent private halls, which have a slightly special status in that they are they're permitted to, so they can have people doing normal Oxford degrees, as it happens at Wycliffe, mostly in theology, but a few in related areas like philosophy. But also they're allowed to have people there who are training for ordination in the Church of England.
There you go. Well, look, I've been able to visit you there once or twice over the years, and it's always interesting to be kind of go into that atmosphere of learning and just an opportunity for people to really study and think deeply about subjects. And so it's a really privileged place to be, I'm sure. And one that we sometimes see on our screens, you know, on Inspector Morse or something, you know, from a distance. But it's great to have you here, just to sort of share some of your wisdom, some of the research that you've been involved in as a Christian academic, someone thinking deeply about these issues. But of course, where we're really going to begin is your own story, Max, because this is called Why I Believe. So we're going to get to, well, exactly what was your journey to becoming a believing Christian. So do you want to just start us off from the beginning? What sort of home environment were you raised in?
Sure. So oldest of 3 boys, grew up in, well, sort of Lincolnshire, 3 years in Africa, Malawi, and then high school in Dorchester, Dorset. And I suppose I would say I had a kind of loosely Christian upbringing, and actually something I'm very thankful to my parents for is the fact that they were always very clear that it's completely up to you whether you want to be a Christian or not. So we went to church, actually to the cathedral in Lincoln, and so I went to Sunday school, and I think I would say I did have a genuine faith as a child. I would pray kind of without, you know, being told to sometimes. So but as often happens, I suppose, by the time I was a teenager, I was kind of losing interest, and Sunday school was optional, so I chose the option of not going.
Staying in bed on Sunday morning.
Exactly, staying in bed on Sunday mornings. And it certainly wouldn't have been kind of hostile to Christian faith. And I certainly wouldn't have been an atheist in a kind of really thought through sense, more just kind of apathetic or agnostic. By the time I was kind of late teenage years, I was sort of, again, still definitely not an atheist, or certainly not a sort of materialist. I believed all sorts of things. I thought there were aliens and ghosts, and it wasn't very systematized and thought through. But I was quite suspicious of evangelical Christianity. I was actually, one time, a friend of mine was going on a gap year and asked if I would come to a farewell send-off, and I quickly realised that this was a church service.
Oh, he duped you into attending church.
Yeah, I had been duped into going to church, and I was there was quite a lot of talk about unbelievers from the front, and I was quite scared.
You felt like they were centering on you or something like that.
Yeah.
So you were a little bit sort of apathetic, agnostic, had this experience where you felt you'd been slightly tricked into turning up at church. So by the time you got to university, I think it was Exeter?
That's right.
What happened at that point?
Yeah, well, so I had a gap year when I thought I was going to find the meaning of life, traveling the world. And, you know, I did go to some interesting places, mainly in Australia and America, but it wasn't this epiphany that I thought it was going to be. I came back and was sort of, then the next thing was, university, that's going to be the peak experience. You know, going to party and, you know, smoke lots of weed, which I was doing at the time, and that kind of thing, get drunk. And so, and basically that is how things started off for me at university, and I wasn't really attending lectures. So I had enrolled to do philosophy, upon my mum's suggestion, being an RE teacher, she thought, oh, you'd find this interesting. I was like, oh, yeah, fine. I didn't really go to the lectures. And so, and so I was really trying to, as it were, kind of find the meaning of life and you know, the university experience, as it were, but it was just not really turning out to be that.
Okay, so you'd hope to have some kind of, again, epiphany, those long conversations into the night, smoking weed, but they didn't turn into much in the end.
No, they didn't, and it actually seemed to me that the friendships I had formed, which were mainly based around smoking weed and drinking, were just quite shallow, actually. And as it happened in halls of residence, I was in a hall of residence with about 100 people. So it was a really beautiful kind of, almost like a boarding school, really. And there were about 10 or 15 Christians. And they had, you know, it's like, wow, that's quite a lot of Christians.
That's quite a high percentage.
Quite a high percentage. Yeah. But I sort of got to know some of them, and I was intrigued because suddenly the conversations were a bit more meaningful, the friendship seemed a bit more authentic. It wasn't just about how many pints you could down in 5 minutes and that kind of thing. And so gradually I sort of started gravitating more towards that as a friendship group. And I suppose that set me on a journey which kind of had two aspects to it. So one was being drawn to what I found was an authentic experience of Christian community of a sort that I'd not really had encountered before. It was quite attractive. And then the other was being put onto the intellectual case for Christianity, which before I hadn't even realized existed. I suppose I'd think, if I was asked as a teenager, you know, is there any evidence for the resurrection? I'd have sort of thought that was an odd question, is there any evidence for Zeus or something?
Yes, sure.
So yeah, I suppose so. I was reading books like The Case for Christ, which then in turn kind of put me on, because he kind of interviews different people like William Lane Craig. So then I wanted to read their books, and I kind of gradually got into the more sort of philosophical type material like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, and it wasn't, there was no kind of date I could pinpoint when I became a Christian, I don't think. But over a period of about 3 or 4 months, I gradually felt like, okay, this is stacking up, there's something.
And it was this combination, from what you're saying, of both finding this friendship group and sort of appreciating the way they treated you and the friendship you had with them and the nature of the conversations. And obviously going on this quite intellectual journey, you by yourself reading a book, sort of starting to realise, oh, there's more to this stuff than I'd realised. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think it was, in particular, there was this young guy who actually wasn't a student, but he was like a CU guest that they would do this thing, the CU Missions Week. They would have these guests who'd come and talk to students during the week. And there was this guy who is a young doctor. And I wasn't all that impressed with the Mission Week talks as such, but this guy was really thoughtful, and we were playing table tennis late at night in the college common room, the hall common room, and he was just taking my questions really seriously, and it made me think, okay, actually, where I'd assumed that to be a serious Christian, you had to be a bit weird and probably kind of not think too hard. This guy really changed my mind about that.
That's interesting. It is amazing how individuals or just simply going into a community that turns out not to be full of weirdos and brain-dead people can just take down some of the barriers, can't it, in that way, even before you've started to have the conversations specifically about faith.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question is simply sort of, what was the next stage? Did you come to a point where, actually, I think I've embraced this, I want to be baptized? I mean, and how did your wider friends and family view that? Because obviously you hadn't shown signs of this much before going to university.
No, that's a good question. So I think, my friends who I'd started off being my main friendship group, thought it was, they weren't mean about it, but I think they thought it was disappointing that I would kind of capitulate to this weird view of the world.
Right, okay.
And they kept teasing me about the fact that I didn't want to partake of the weed anymore.
The weed had to go.
It did. I think family-wise, it was sort of, I think my parents were fine with it. And I think to be honest, I hadn't really necessarily talked to them much about what my religious views had been throughout teenage years anyway, so it was a bit of a black box to them. But so I did get baptized in the summer of that, at the end of that first year of university. Actually got baptized in the sea at Exmouth, sorry.
Right. And that was the start of, obviously, the beginning of a journey like that, there's always a lot more to be said about as you continue to go on and so on. Maybe just quickly sketch out sort of how things progressed for you academically at that point.
So the thing that's interesting is because sometimes I get asked by people, was it difficult, especially people in church have asked me, is it difficult being a Christian and doing philosophy? But my experience was that philosophy sort of went very well with being a Christian. So the irony is, in a way, it was only when I became a Christian that I got interested in philosophy. I actually started going to lectures that I'd been skipping up until that point.
Turning up for the course.
I did.
That you were supposed to be there for,
And for me, I suddenly, the lights went on and it was sort of like, oh wow, there's this whole world of ideas to be explored. And the thought that there is this, the logos, as John's gospel, the word that was in the beginning, the logos, that rational structure was there from eternity. That sort of seemed to just be the perfect framework within which one could start to explore all these ideas. And I wasn't even really put off by the fact, so some of my lecturers at Exeter were Christians, and still are. There were one or two who would sort of take a pop at belief in God every so often. And the problem sheets for this sort of that you'd have to do each week would have things like show why the ontological argument is absurd, that kind of thing. But that
we won't get you to go into what the ontological argument is, but yes, it was basically suggestions that can you debunk a Christian argument for God?
That's right, exactly. And actually, maybe surprisingly, given that I wasn't at all really equipped to kind of engage deeply with the sorts of objections they were putting across at that point, I wasn't that fazed by it.
Right. Okay. That's interesting to hear. But you got turned on to the world of philosophy. Interestingly, and did the idea of pursuing this kind of come into view?
Yeah. So by my third year, I was finding that I'd actually really come alive to academic study. Because before that, I think I'd kind of coasted through A-levels and wouldn't say I loved study, but I really did. I think I'd basically found my niche by the end of my third year. And I was actually doing a joint undergraduate degree by the end in theology and philosophy combined. So yeah, it was becoming clear to me, and lecturers were encouraging me to think about going on. I actually decided I didn't want to go straight on, so I did a year out working basically as an intern for my church in Exeter, and my now wife Michelle did the same intern program, and we got engaged that year. But yeah, it became pretty clear that I think it was right to go back. So then I went back and did a master's in philosophy at Exeter, and then so my late grandfather had done his undergraduate at Oxford, and my wife Michelle said, because I really thought by that point, my master's year, that I should consider doing a PhD. And so I was thinking about where to apply to, and I thought I just thought it probably didn't have a good chance of getting into Oxford, but Michelle said, "Oh no, you should. Your granddad would have wanted you to." So I did, and I was very fortunate to get an offer. So went and took up that offer to go and do a PhD at Oxford in 2010, and that was really quite a significant coming to Oxford. Especially around the time of sort of peak New Atheism, was really interesting because, of course, Richard Dawkins being at Oxford, I had the impression from the outside before going there that Oxford would be this bastion of atheism. But I got there and pretty quickly I was connected up with various Christian postgraduates and academics through sort of church networks and so on, and discovered this network called Developing a Christian Mind, which is run by some good friends. Ard Louis was a wonderful physicist and a Christian there. It's quite key in running that network. And I was blown away by just how kind of intentional all of these Christians were across multiple different departments, much more than I'd seen going on at Exeter, really. And yes, it's true that was kind of peak New Atheism, but actually I was really surprised by how much there was in terms of really serious Christianity at quite high levels of the university.
I think that sometimes is a bit of a misunderstanding. I was a student at Oxford University, and from the outside you might think, gosh, a young Christian going off to somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, what will happen to their faith? But actually, those two universities have the strongest Christian unions in the country, and very strong church communities, and a really strong Christian academic presence, surprisingly
absolutely.
so very often. I think people fail to realise, actually. I mean, this is an interesting sort of aside as well, is that a lot of people might assume philosophy as an academic subject is essentially dominated by atheist thinking. I've heard, though, that actually in more recent decades, there's been a bit of a renaissance in Christians coming into that sphere. So do you want to sort of sketch out briefly a bit of the history of what's happened
sure. There? Okay, so really what happens in the 20th century in analytic philosophy, which is the kind of philosophy that's done in the English-speaking world predominantly, especially in sort of the heartlands of Cambridge and Oxford, you've got this school of thought called logical positivism, which
you're going to have to explain.
Which I will explain, which is completely dominant. So logical positivism basically says that the only way for a claim to be able to be rationally believed is for it to be empirically testable.
Sort of like scientifically
So like, yes.
Right.
So it's got to be the kind of thing, in principle, you could do an experiment to verify it. Or it's got to be something like 2 + 2 = 4. It's kind of self-evident.
Okay.
And so the thought is, well, but God's existence is not either of those things. And so the idea of philosophers taking God seriously is just completely off the table, really, in the middle of the 20th century.
So this was the dominant sort of perspective in philosophy.
The dominant perspective. A.J. Ayer, a name you may have heard of. So he was one of the main proponents of this. He was at Oxford. Actually, my grandfather had tutorials with A.J. Ayer, and it was pretty rough, apparently.
Interesting.
But then what starts to happen is that a number of attacks come against logical positivism, and one at the time young Christian philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga is someone who's bringing a particular charge against logical positivism of that it undermines itself. So the thought being that if we're only allowed to believe in things that are self-evident, 2 + 2 = 4, or things that can be tested in a laboratory, I suppose, can that theory itself be? Is it either
can logical positivism, the idea that you can only believe in things that can be empirically tested?
Yeah.
could you do the same to that
yes,
idea?
That's
basically?
right,
Could you test it?
That's right, and it seemed that you can't. It doesn't seem to kind of pass its own test, and so and a number of other critiques are brought against it.
So it's a sort of self-defeating kind of way of looking at
yes,
things.
That's right, and A.J. Ayer himself, by the end of his career, is sort of saying that, it's basically admitting that it was largely a waste of time to have to have defended that. So yes, but so what the death of logical positivism means is that a space has now opened up where you can once again start to do serious work in philosophy on topics that don't fit that criteria of having to be empirically testable. And so people start once again to think about questions to do with what's known as metaphysics. So metaphysics would encompass kind of the philosophical study of concepts like time, the nature of the mind, free will, and indeed whether God exists. And so suddenly it's sort of open season again for talking about these traditional topics that for hundreds of years before that had been kind of
off the table.
bread, until logical positivism sort of put a damper on things. Those had been very much kind of the mainstay of philosophy, and were once again back. And so Alvin Plantinga is one example of someone who really led that charge and of saying, okay, let's kind of get those old philosophical arguments for God out of the cupboard, dust them off, see what we can do with them, and indeed also come up with some new ones. And he's by no means the only person. So Richard Swinburne on this side of the Atlantic is someone who's done a great deal in terms of sort of building quite a comprehensive philosophical case for God.
Well, I know from having spoken to others in this field that there's been a real kind of movement, especially people like Plantinga, bringing other young graduates through, and now there are far more Christians actually involved in philosophy than there were. But I want to come back to sort of the atmosphere you did meet in academia and culture when you got to Oxford University. 2010, as you say, was sort of the high watermark, arguably, of this new atheist phenomenon. It's one I talk about, obviously, in my book, and by that time I was hosting quite a few conversations on my Unbelievable show between these sort of very dogmatic new atheist figures like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, opposite, often people that you've mentioned. Alvin Plantinga came on the show. We had Daniel Dennett, William Lane Craig, another well-known Christian philosopher. So what were you encountering then in terms of their arguments and some of the atmosphere at that time, and how were you trying to respond yourself?
It's a good question. So I think, one thing that was interesting was when I was talking to a professor trying to work out a topic for my PhD dissertation, and I said, I'd be quite interested to do something engaging with the new atheists, and he kind of said, it's not taken very seriously in serious academia.
Right.
So I thought, that's interesting. And actually, that did start to become, and I think that there really was, it was apparent to me then that there was quite a split between the perception among the wider public about these new atheist figures like Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, Hitchens, and so on, as though they really sort of spoke for enlightened thinking, civilization, and actually the slight almost embarrassment of some, including some atheist academics, who would be less well known to the wider public.
And they felt like the arguments they were putting out in these very high-profile books and lectures and events, they didn't think they were that good. Even the atheist
I think that's
sort of
right.
philosophers.
And someone that you've interviewed, I know, Michael Roos was someone I was aware of. So Michael Roos is a professor of philosophy, and he's an atheist or agnostic. I'm not quite sure, but definitely not a Christian. But he was saying at the time, Dawkins has no idea what he's talking about. He has that section in The God Delusion where he kind of does a rundown of the arguments for God and why they're all rubbish. And Michael Roos said, Dawkins doesn't know what these arguments are.
I think he basically said if one of my students had handed this in as an essay, it would have red marks all over
Yeah.
it, basically was
Yes.
his summary of it. I encountered the same thing, though having said all that, you can't deny that the new atheism and those characters did have an effect on the general public. And yes, the academics might have said, well, it's not really that strong. But nonetheless, it came across as quite a powerful
absolutely.
case.
And
in public.
certainly, I've, as you know, like a fairly new Christian actually at that time was sometimes kind of worried about the certainly the emotional force of the new atheism, and there definitely was that sense of, gosh, you know, they really are. And I think particularly some of the critiques of the God of the Old Testament, those kind of things would be troubling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, did you ever kind of end up participating in any of those sorts of debates in the course of your career?
I remember, I think you may have come along to one of the meetings actually. A really good friend of mine, Richard Park, set up this sort of informal, I guess, talking shop kind of group where it was explicitly meant for people from both atheist, Christian and other worldviews to come along, and sort of on a Wednesday evening, I think, and we'd have a topic and we'd kind of go at it.
Down at the pub or something?
Yes, that's right. And
we'd end up at the pub.
The president then of the Oxford Atheist Society would come along to that. And so, yeah, there was this sense that in a way the conversations that were going on up there, and some of which you were hosting, were being played out in my friendship groups and so on. And I also certainly remember going to the Sheldonian Theatre, is the kind of posh sort of theatre in the centre of Oxford where the graduations happen, and a number of big high profile debates and sort of talks by new atheist figures like Anthony Grayling, Sam Harris, Dawkins, all took place there that I went to.
Yes. I mean, in a way, I was always a bit frustrated that Dawkins, you know, the prime new atheist, you know, with the best-selling book, never really engaged his best opponents in the sense that, there were some occasions when he would do some sort of a dialogue with someone, but I very distinctively remember myself in 2011 being part of a group that helped to bring William Lane Craig over, this quite distinguished Christian philosopher from the US. And we were really hoping to get him in discussion with William Lane Craig, because Craig had done a number of responses to him, and unfortunately Dawkins gave all kinds of reasons why he wasn't prepared to debate Craig. Now, this was happening not long after that atheist bus campaign. You might remember it. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So we rather cheekily had our own bus campaign in Oxford. For the Oxford event, we had invited Richard Dawkins, and we were leaving an empty chair for him at the Sheldonian Theatre if he wanted to take it up and debate the question of God with William Lane Craig. So our posters ran instead, "There's probably no Dawkins, but come along and find out on the particular day." It was a little bit cheeky, but it was quite fun at the same time. And we had a packed house for the event, even though Richard Dawkins didn't show. Anyway, these are just some of the fun memories. I mean, before we come to questions, and please do take a snap of the Slido QR code. We'd love to have some of your questions. I'm going to start looking at them. But I mean, what perhaps if you could maybe sketch out one area where you've particularly poured your interest and thought into, and just give us a sense of what the arguments for and against God are that you've sort of looked at in that respect.
Sure, yeah. So I think the topic of divine hiddenness is an area that I've focused on quite a lot in my academic research over the last few years. It's not actually what I did my PhD on, but
so divine hiddenness.
Yeah, let me unpack that.
Okay.
So divine hiddenness is a shorthand way of talking about the way in which the evidence for God, even if we want to say it's quite strong, it's not just kind of blindingly obvious that there's a God, right? And so some atheist philosophers have taken this and turned it into an argument against God's existence. And the most well-known person who's done that is a Canadian philosopher called John Schellenberg. And his argument basically says, look, if there were a loving God who wanted relationship with everyone, he would have made it so that it was, it was just really obvious that there was a God. So there wouldn't be anyone out there who would be open to having a relationship with God, but finding themselves sort of not sure what to believe. That would not happen if there was a loving God. But it does happen in our world, according to Schellenberg, and therefore God doesn't exist, according to that argument. So, that's an argument, and there are sort of various versions of it that I've spent a bit of time thinking about and have published a few different articles on.
What would be your elevator pitch response to that? Because I know you've written whole papers responding to that argument, but what might be your 1 minute version? Yeah,
basically I think it has various assumptions built in. That argument has various assumptions built into it about God's aims, and it seems to me that it makes a dubious assumption in terms of what God would want and what God would need in order to have meaningful relationship with us would be for us to be maximally certain about his existence. And I think there are a number of good reasons that one could think about why, actually, there might be certain things that God wants other than us being maximally certain that potentially would even require us to not be maximally certain. Things like our ability to exercise morally significant free will, our ability to have to exercise trust despite the lack of total certainty, and a number of other things like that I think, at least I don't think they provide a completely sort of comprehensive answer, but as a bit like with the problem of evil, I think they go some way to helping us to think, okay, maybe there is a bigger picture here that in which it can be we can reconcile this situation.
I mean, I've come across that objection myself, and I'm not sure that my response really adequately responds to Schellenberg's particular version of it. But I've always thought it's possible that God isn't actually that interested in people just believing in him.
Yeah.
What the New Testament seems to want of us, and what God seems to want of us, is us trusting in him. And that's a slightly different thing to just being shown obvious evidence that God exists.
Right.
And because trust is something that you do, it's an act where you don't necessarily have absolutely blinding obvious evidence, but there's something about the trusting itself that is part of the journey of knowing God, in a sense.
Absolutely, and I think that so sometimes if we're thinking, well, does the Bible address this question in terms of what faith is supposed to be? And perhaps the clearest cut passage that does talk about that is Hebrews 11. Now, on the face of it, it might seem to give a definition of faith in terms of certainty.
Just repeat it for us.
Yeah, so faith is the certainty of, substance of things unseen. And
that's the sort of a version of it,
So the thing is that then the author of Hebrews goes on to give a number of examples of kind of exemplars of faith. And what's interesting is that, so think about Abraham is I think the first one. And Abraham is commended, but what's he commended for? It doesn't seem to me that he's commended for an intellectual act of believing. He's commended for doing something, namely being willing to leave his homeland and go somewhere that he wasn't even sure where he was going. But what he's commended for that sort of risky act of trust, rather than for the sort of act of mentally assenting to something. I completely agree with the way you put it, Justin. I think that God is most interested in trust. And that's probably actually the best way to translate the word that the Bible uses, that sometimes we translate as faith, the pistis. Actually, it probably is best translated as trust.
Well, look, we've got quite a few questions that have come in. So thank you so much for talking to me for the last 40 minutes or so. But let's go to some of the questions coming in. Again, feel free to add your questions as we go along and we've probably got time for a good 25 minutes or so of questions here. Here's one that's put in an interesting way. It might need a little bit of interpretation, but it says, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" By which I think the person is meaning Athens was, the great centre of intellectual thought, philosophy. Yeah. Jerusalem, obviously, the place where Judaism and Christianity were birthed, the kind of faith and, revelation through Scripture. And so it's that old question of, can we bring those two things together in that way? The intellectual pursuit of philosophy versus the sort of the revelation of God through a people and an experience and so on.
That's a great question. So there's so many ways to come at this. Well, let me first say that I think once you start to articulate the Christian worldview and you start to bring it into contact with the sorts of questions that we all have encountered, you cannot help but be doing philosophy. The minute you start talking about, maybe God wants us to have free will, and free will is incompatible with God just kind of making us robotically do what he wants, you're doing philosophy implicitly already. It seems to me as though the early church, from a pretty early stage, embraced the thought that articulating the gospel message with the vocabulary that was, the philosophical vocabulary that was there to hand, was perfectly, perfectly all right to do. And actually, if John's gospel is absolutely saturated with concepts that would be very familiar to people schooled in Greek philosophy. So that opening of John's Gospel, that in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John is absolutely kind of keying into philosophical concepts that his audience would kind of light up and think, oh, okay, that the Logos is the sort of rational principle of the universe. Oh, but it's personal. Oh, and it's become flesh and blood. And so I think that's one thing I would want to say.
I think as well, on hearing Athens, is, well, it's there in the New Testament. Paul goes to Athens, and he speaks with the philosophers, the Stoics.
He didn't do very well, and he didn't write a book to them.
Well, as a matter of opinion, how do you think Paul did in his discussion with the philosophers in Athens?
Some of them mocked him, but some of them wanted to come back for more, apparently. Which I think is kind of probably both of our experience.
Well, let's go to another question. Adam wants to know, what for you is the most compelling argument for God's existence?
Well, okay, I have to caveat this first by saying the way I think about this whole issue of arguing for God's existence is that there's no need to put all our eggs in one basket, as it were. So the kind of Christian philosophers who I admire, people like Richard Swinburne, would suggest that we should be thinking in terms of a cumulative case. So if you want a pictorial image, an analogy for that. So you think, an individual twig is easy to snap, right? But if you have a whole bundle of twigs, that's very difficult to snap. So basically, if you have a number of different considerations, each of which has some sort of force in terms of making it more likely that there's a God, when you put lots of those together, you can end up with quite a powerful case. So in that sense, there's no need to sort of single any one of them out and say, well, that's the one I'm kind of
it's
leaning on.
It's a bit like the detective who has, a thesis about who committed the murder,
yes.
And one little piece of evidence won't do the job, but once he puts all the pieces together, exactly. you've got a cumulative case that's overwhelming.
Exactly, but even still, I will try and answer the question directly. So I'm happy to sort of single out some of the things I think are particularly compelling. So I actually do think that the fact that we're able to we're able to do rational thought, as it were, that we're able to evaluate arguments, we're able to kind of we're able to rationally evaluate anything at all is very surprising if we're living in a materialistic universe.
A godless universe.
A godless universe, that's right. But not surprising if we're living in a universe.
Okay. Unpack that for us just a little bit.
Yeah, so the thought is that, okay, let's grant the idea that our minds are the products of a process of evolution. I mean, I'm happy to go with that as a scientific description of things. But if our minds are ultimately a process of a completely unguided process, then there's not much reason to think that we should be able to reason about matters far beyond everyday kind of survival concerns. Yeah. And so it seems really quite surprising that we would be able to do calculus, that we would be able to, let alone do accurate kind of reasoning about.
It's a bit extravagant, the abilities of our mind in that sense.
Yeah, I think so. And another thing would be the fine-tuning of the universe. So this is the discovery that's been made by physicists in the last few decades that let's just pick on gravity. So it seems as though the strength of the force of gravity could have been different than it is in our universe. And actually, it's so sensitive that if it was changed by the tiniest amount, a hair's breadth, sort of one part in 10 to the 60, that would be, it would mean that the universe couldn't contain galaxies, stars, planets. But gravity is just one example of maybe a couple of dozen ways in which the universe appears to be fine-tuned for life. And so that again seems to be something that's quite surprising if we're in a godless reality, but not surprising if God exists.
So in a sense, I get the sense that you're not saying any of these is a slam dunk, absolutely unquestionable argument, but that you're looking at the kind of the balance of probabilities and saying, right. Would I expect to see this in a universe with God versus a universe without God? And on balance, it looks like it makes more sense in this universe. And
then the third one, just really quickly, is the phenomenon of consciousness. We have this first-person perspective on the world. I take it this chair doesn't have that. It's actually, when you think about it, it's really weird that there is such a thing as what it feels like to be me. And that's something that doesn't look like it sits very comfortably in a picture in which at bottom there are just physical forces and particles and so on.
Fascinating, thank you. We'll go to another question here. Obviously staying on the philosophical track, which philosopher in the history of the church do you think has had the best influence on the church? You might want to say who's had the worst influence as well, but what do you think? If you were to reach back to the philosophers in the Christian tradition?
That's a great question. Of course, it slightly depends who you classify as a philosopher and whether you'd say, they're a theologian, not a philosopher. I mean,
was there
it's
really
hard
a
to pick one
in the past?
I'm not sure there was. I think Augustine had some brilliant ideas. I think I especially love Augustine's way of thinking about what sin is. So he had this idea that what sin is it's not that we love evil things per se, it's that we love things that are good, but we love them in the wrong order, or we love them too much compared to the way we love God and other people and so on. I've always found that a really helpful notion, and there's all sorts of things that flow from that. It's hard to, let's go with Augustine.
Okay, Augustine. Someone has a really specific question here, and this is going to get us into sort of potentially technical territory. But I think this person may have asked the same question more or less 3 or 4 times, so they really want it answered here. So it's the question of something called Molinism. Okay. So one person, I assume it's the same person probably, asks, could you explain what Molinism is? Yeah. And another question asks, Calvinism, Arminianism, or Molinism? Now, do you want to just explain what these 3 terms, and Molinism in particular, are generally referring to?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So there's this whole puzzle about how we could have free will if God knows everything, including the future. So Molinism is an attempt to solve this that tries to hang on to us having real free will and God really knowing the future. And the way it tries to have the cake and eat it, as it were, is by saying that God has this knowledge of this special kind of truth. And it's a truth of the form, if Max were in situation X, then he would freely do Y. But the key thing is, God doesn't make that true. Somehow I make it true, even if X is a situation that will never actually happen. But so because God knows all of those truths,
all
he
of
can
the possibilities of what you would freely do in any
possible situation. So then God can, on that basis, work out what will happen, what I will freely do. Because he knows, okay, he's going to be in that situation, he's going to be offered the bribe to give a first to a student, and I can see he's freely going to take the bribe.
I can see this is also a confession for you as well. No, I'm joking. Okay, I don't know how if everyone's happy with that idea. So this is a huge, big picture, and this is just one answer to it.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to sort of just briefly sketch out the other two that this person said, the Calvinist view and the Arminian view?
Right. So the Calvinist view again is a view on this whole question of how God relates to us and our freedom. So basically, the Calvinist view says that we don't have that kind of freedom. We don't have the freedom where I really could have done other than the thing that I actually did do. And God actually, everything that I do is ultimately because God has predetermined that I will do it. That's right. So then it's simple on that picture how God gets to know the future, because it's ultimately in his sovereign will.
And Arminianism?
Right. So yeah, Arminianism isn't exactly. So Arminianism would say that we do have real free will, and that basically what Arminianism says about how it is that we have the real freedom to choose to reject God or accept God is that God has given us this sort of what they would call prevenient grace, which is it's like he's given us the ability to kind of put our hand up and ask for help, as it were, whereas the Calvinist wants to say it's completely up to, whether you even put your hand up or not, that's up to God too.
Yeah. So which one is the right one? Or is it none of the three?
Well, so I'm not sure about Molinism. I think there are some quite good objections to it. I suppose I'm happy to say I lean towards the Arminian view, but I want to be fully respectful of my Calvinist friends, of whom I have a number. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think, to be honest, when you look at the New Testament, each side can find verses that support their view, Arminian or Calvinist. I don't think it's a straightforward matter of, but this verse says it's like that. And actually, it's a bigger picture.
I mean, I've engaged in a lot of these debates over the years, or hosted them at least, and I've often thought the problem is that we are obviously looking at it from a very human perspective, and if you're talking about a God who in some way transcends time and transcends our human categories, are we ever going to really get to the bottom of this with our kind of limited perspective? So, which kind of leads me to the question, is it even worth kind of spilling all this ink and having all these debates over it?
Yeah, I sympathise, and for that reason, that's not a topic I've spent much time on.
Have you spent much time on this one? It's another philosophical question. What do you think is the most compelling philosophical argument for the existence, not of God, but of the soul? The soul.
I like this. Well, I was talking about this today, actually, at some of the grammar schools in the area. So actually, I don't think I was once of the view that the mind depended on the brain. Without getting into lots of kind of jargon, there's kind of three different views you could have on the mind, roughly. One is that the mind and the brain just are the same thing. It's just all physical. Another view is that the mind is qualitatively different from the brain. What it feels like to see red and taste coffee, that's not a physical thing about the world, but it does depend on a functioning brain. And then the third view would be that no, the mind and the brain are actually distinct entities that interact, but the mind could exist without the brain.
That's what you might call a
dualist view. And so I shifted from that second position to the third one. And the main reason I did that was actually not so much because of abstract kind of conceptual arguments, but more because of what I find quite fascinating phenomenon of near-death experiences, which are essentially these cases. I mean, some of you may have come across this, but it has been studied in quite a scientific way, where the classic sort of case would be one where someone is in a state of cardiac arrest, and basically from a scientific point of view, their brain is inactive, until they get resuscitated, but during that time, they've had an experience, often extremely lucid, and sometimes they'd say the most meaningful experience of their lives. But the most interesting cases to me are the ones where that experience involved watching themselves from above and what the medics were doing to them and so on, and where that can be corroborated independently.
They knew details that they couldn't possibly have known if they really were just basically unconscious on the table.
And so just to give one case that's in one of these kind of case study books on this, one man had a near-death experience during his cardiac arrest, and he described hovering above his body and then actually going up into the room above, and he described it as there was a sort of big room, but with lots of little rooms around it, and on the beds were lying people, but they looked sort of like not real people. Almost like dolls, and he said, I thought that was really odd. And the doctor said his jaw dropped, because above the intensive care unit where the man was being cared for is a nurse training centre with these stations around it with medical mannequins on. And so it wasn't even in the same room. It was
in any way something he could have known.
No,
he wasn't pulling
not.
The wool over their eyes. He wouldn't have had any. I've read similar fascinating examples.
And I know you interviewed Dale Allison, recently, who's quite interested in these cases.
Who's also researched this area. I mean, it's fascinating because that's so interesting that very specific kind of examples of these near-death experiences convinced you that actually there is something separate to our physical brain, that there's a soul in that sense. How do you kind of put that together with your Christian faith, though? What's going on there would you say, from a Christian perspective?
Well, that's a great question. So I think, in a sense, the biblical data on this is, I think it could to some extent be interpreted either in terms of that second view or the third view. Now, I would want to say it leans a bit more towards the idea that the mind or the soul can separate from the body. I suppose the way I would think about it is this. It's quite clear Paul and Jesus and the other New Testament authors think that the final destiny is a resurrection body. The new creation, the new heavens and the new earth will have resurrection bodies. So we won't just be kind of floating around disembodied. But in between now and then, Paul seems to think, I would suggest, that if he's to be put to death, as he's thinking he might be in Philippians, he fully expects to be with Christ, but awaiting the resurrection of the body. So I would suggest there does seem to be this intermediate state in which a person's soul is disembodied until the bodily resurrection. And so I would suggest, that seems to fit reasonably well with the NDEs.
Very interesting. Phil wants to know, is it possible for science to ever explain so much that the need for philosophy will disappear, or is it always going to be necessary to have philosophy?
Well, I mean, I think that, so let's approach it like this. I mean, science itself makes philosophical assumptions, I would suggest. And to that extent, no. For science will. So what philosophical assumptions does science make? Well, science, it assumes it doesn't kind of discover or kind of empirically verify that. It assumes that the world is rationally understandable by our minds. It assumes that We can infer from what goes on in the present, what we've observed up until this point, that the world will keep behaving in the same way. It assumes that there is a kind of law-like structure. And so, yes, I think I would say that. But I think there are many other questions that science doesn't even try to answer. But at the very least, so science, by its very nature, is not trying to ask those questions, and indeed, insofar as it kind of makes those assumptions, it's not in a position to explain how it is that we can do science.
So even, I mean, I've heard some scientists, again, like Richard Dawkins, being very disparaging, not only of theology, but also philosophy, and say, come on, those aren't real subjects. Let's get on with doing the real stuff of science. So why do you think we need philosophers and theologians just as much as scientists like Richard Dawkins?
Yeah, well, I think that science is wonderful, but it's the whole point of the scientific revolution in the sort of 17th century and so on was to deliberately narrow the target and say we're going to investigate cause and effect in space and time in a way that we can sort of subject to this kind of testing, and we'll make loads of progress like that. But it was a deliberate actually narrowing of the target of what's under investigation. And so I don't think it was ever supposed to be this all-encompassing enterprise. And also, I haven't said anything about ethics. So the question of whether it's right, let's say, so science has produced nuclear weapons, but should we use them?
That's not a scientific
question. I don't think it's a scientific question. Right. And insofar as if someone comes along and says that it is, so Sam Harris, as you know, wrote a book in, I think, 2011, basically saying, oh no, ethics is a scientific matter, because, what ethics is about is making the most people happy, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and we can measure happiness with brain scanners. And so, oh yeah, great, but is ethics about doing the great?
He kind of assumed the answer.
He'd assumed that ethical principle that the good thing to do is to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and then he kind of did his thing with the science. But actually, that key assumption. That's a philosophical matter,
which he had just assumed without really investigating it. So much more I'd love to talk to you about, but maybe just a good place to end. This is a question here which asks, what do you think the church could be doing? What more could the church be doing? So I suppose, would you like to see, more of that sort of very intellectual aspect of investigating the Christian faith from this philosophical perspective? Would you like to see more of that in the church? I mean, or is it just for a kind of very select band of, highly kind of, their brain is wired that way type of people?
I definitely would love to see more of that. And I think, I think there's probably two things that could happen here. One is that academics, I suppose, like me, could definitely do a better job of explaining kind of our fields and so on. And actually, here's a key thing, I maybe haven't said this, but I think that most of the philosophical arguments, whether about God or free will or anything really, often they are that the heart of them is something quite intuitive, that doesn't require lots of technical jargon. That most of the technical jargon is about the kind of splitting of hairs and so on. But actually, the best philosophical arguments are something that I think have some kind of nugget that is really intuitive. And so I think people like me could probably do a better job of kind of helping people to kind of get a hold of what is that, what are those nuggets. But I also think, maybe I think the church needs to be more embracing of and not fearful of philosophy and theology and academia more generally, and I think appreciating that it's not kind of inherently a threat to the Christian faith, but actually something. I mean, when you think about where our great universities came from, I mean, thoroughly Christian origins that Oxford, Cambridge, and so on had, and something that I think we should want to cherish. And
for some people, it's a route to faith, as it obviously has been for you. Have you met other people for whom this kind of philosophical journey has led them to Christian faith?
Many people, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so I really want to be careful in not saying that someone has to come to faith in a really intellectualized way. But I think what we should be able to offer people is kind of a really holistic apologetic, if you like, that one that speaks to the whole person, one that speaks to people's sort of desire for meaning, for community, but also for an intellectual view of the world that makes sense and feels intellectually satisfying.
Well, it's been a very intellectually satisfying evening tonight. So can we have a round of applause for Max? Now, Sam mentioned that there is a book coming out. It is a more academic type. I understand, though, it is available already as a digital thing.
That is correct, yes.
What's the name of the book?
Yes, so the name is God and the Problem of Evidential Ambiguity. It trips off the tongue, doesn't it, Justin?
But it is available.
It is.
So if you want a deep dive, God and the Problem of Evidential Ambiguity is available online and soon to be in print.
Yes.
There are, of course, probably some more sort of lay-level places people can start all of this as well, aren't
absolutely.
there? Any book recommendations beyond
actually,
that one?
I think Tim Keller's The Reason for God is a pretty good place to start. And what I love is that he makes the arguments really accessible, but if you look in the footnotes or the endnotes, then he's got Swinburne, Plantinga, and T. Wright. So I think that's really good. In terms of an area I love thinking about, the kind of historical reliability of the Gospels, I don't think one can do better than Peter J. Williams. Can We Trust the Gospels? That's a really brilliant book.
Great, some great recommendations there. Thank you again. Just one more round of applause, if you would, for Max. We'll be here for a little longer if you want to come and say hi and talk to Max. There are books available as well out in the foyer as well, so do check those out. If anyone wants to pick up a copy of one of my books, let me know. But thank you again. Sam, do you want to close up or? Okay, well, thank you again for coming. God bless you. If you can come back next week, I'll be here again, and it's going to be a really fabulous interview next week. So do come back if you possibly can. Thank you.